Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, and this is Reality Asserts Itself. Early in May, Pope Francis announced new rules on the reporting of sexual abuse within the church. Essentially, no one in the church can allow pedophilia or sexual abuse to go unreported. They must report it to their superiors. They cannot participate in any kind of cover-up. But these rules have been critiqued by survivors of sexual abuse within the church because they say it's the police that should be told, not just superiors within the church. Here's a clip of Sean Doherty, who is a survivor of sexual abuse. He's now an activist on these issues, and here's what he said.
This is the church ordering the church to report to the church.
So is it almost worse? Because suddenly, shouldn't there be an obligation to call the police?
That should be the number one thing. Call the police first. End of story. Our new policy is call the police first. And if you don't, you're in trouble with the Vatican. These are centuries-old tactics.
Now joining us again to discuss this issue is Matthew Fox. He's a former Catholic priest who was stopped from teaching liberation theology by Cardinal Ratzinger, who then became Pope Benedict, who, if you watch the earlier segment, was part of a cabal exposed in many ways, but in Martel's book on the Vatican, which exposed both Benedict, Pope Paul II, and Burke himself, and many others in the hierarchy connected to the right wing, who have been putting enormous pressure on Francis to defend the morality of the church, although they're not so interested in exposing pedophilia. They're much more interested in denouncing homosexuality, and now, according to this book and many other reports, actually, they themselves were in fact very involved in rather depraved sexual behavior. But now, as I said, joining us is Matthew Fox. Matthew, thanks for joining us again.
Good to be with you, Paul.
So Francis is in this position where the far right is some of them even calling him a heretic for not denouncing homosexuality, not for even suggesting women should have more role in the church, for a whole range of reforms. On the other hand, there's critique of Francis himself that he hasn't got far enough in allowing or making members of the church responsible for really holding sexual abuse accountable. In other words, going to the police. So what do you make of this?
Well, I certainly agree with those, that the Vatican cannot police. They've been trying to or pretending to. And so the Vatican cannot be its own police. So I do think that the police have to get involved to clear this thing up. And what the Vatican could be doing, but again, with the right wing hovering over as much minority as it is, but it's wealthy and it's loud, very loud, and kind of like Fox News, it has its own press dimensions too. But what the Pope could be doing and should be doing is something much more substantive. I mean, he should be turning those things over to the police. Meanwhile, he should be doing, I have a list of like 6 things he can be doing. First of all, to allow priests to get married. Secondly, to ordain women. This would clean up a lot of the skullduggery and secrets going on in the Vatican. Thirdly, to, of course, be open about gay people being ordained and being married. In other words, the papacy has to move into the 21st century. I have called the homophobia in the church as now a dogma practically. This is the case, the Galileo case of the 21st century, because science has spoken back in the 70s. Science admitted it had made a mistake and that being gay is not a sickness. It's perfectly healthy if you can be healthy at doing it. And it applies to about 8% or so of any given human population. So the Vatican should start studying these things and making them public again, that a minority of humans are going to be gay, and that's just fine, gay and lesbian. And another thing they can do is to educate about self-hatred and internalized oppression. Because as we spoke about in our previous session, a lot of these prelates who are making all the rules for everybody else in the church are themselves hating themselves and playing out a weird and sick version of sexuality in their own lives. So I think that the bigger question is you have to flesh out the whole theology of sexuality in the Catholic Church was launched by St. Augustine in the 4th century, not by Jesus. Jesus was not all preoccupied with these things. And Judaism in his day was far more free with sexual practice than the church has become.
Right.
So I think that's what has to happen. The big picture is you got to change the whole teaching of sexuality. And frankly, I think it's too late. That's why I think that, for one thing, everything's too late because we have about 10 years left as a species to turn around climate change. And so this is the big picture. You know, who you're sleeping with and so forth is not the big picture.
Right.
That's just a little game that's being played by, as you said, right-wing, fierce fascists, many of them. And so the bigger picture is a healthy sexual theology. That's what the Pope should be working on. But of course, he's stuck because he's being hounded by, on the one hand, by these right-wing dogmatists who think they know the Orthodox pure tradition. And that's on the one hand. The other hand, of course, he's being attacked, and rightly so, really, by those who want more action on the subject of pedophilia and its cover-up.
Right.
All of which is a great scandal.
So in order to further fight for these values, whether it's climate change or some of his economic issues on economic inequality and so on, he really needs to defeat this right wing of the church. In fact, really, he needs them to be purged. Why wouldn't he want these cases reported to the police? Wouldn't that actually help him in the fight? Given that so many of these right-wingers, I'm mixing it up with what we said in the previous segment about the ring of lust around some of the hierarchy in the Vatican. Why wouldn't it help him to have these cases reported to the police and hopefully even expose the Burkes and the others at the highest levels who are involved in this such depravity?
Well, I think that's a good question. I don't think it's real easy to depose cardinals and even bishops because the structure is so hierarchical. It feeds on itself. And that really comes through, that a lot of these people have been anointed as bishops, cardinals, and so forth by people who have been keeping these secrets, and so they anoint one another. They're even canonizing one another's saints, which is amazing too, and appalling, because under Pope John Paul II, where so much of this corruption took over, they did away with the devil's advocate in canonizing saints. So the first saint they canonized,
which is what, for those who don't know?
The devil's advocate used to be there for centuries to bring up all the shadow stuff, the dark stories about people they're putting up for canonization. So you heard this whole story, not just the people who are thrilled about this person, but also those who have some bad stories to tell. And that's what the devil's advocate did. And they did away with it. And so the very first saint canonized, that did away with it under John Paul II, was Escriva, the fascist founder of Opus Dei. And they made him a saint, which is absurd because he was a complete sexist. He would scream at women, etc. I mean, I read books by women who were his secretaries over the years and telling it what a man he was. He was just full of vitriol and anger and hated women. And he was a practicing fascist. So, and yet they canonized a saint. Who canonized a saint? Well, the right wing in the church canonized him a saint. And then they've been doing that since, frankly, including canonizing John Paul II. I mean, a very knowledgeable priest in South America told me John Paul II is responsible for at least 10,000 murders in South America because of his refusal to support base communities and liberation theology. Also, of course, he supported this very perverse priest, Father Maciel, the founder of his own order, Legionnaires of Christ. he supported him right to the end. And this priest was abusing his seminarians, young men, young teenagers. And it turns out he was married to 2 women on the side and had children and was abusing his children. All this was going on under John Paul II. And people around John Paul knew it, including Cardinal Ratzinger, who was head of the Inquisition at the time. And he did nothing until John Paul II died, and he became Pope. So, there are just so many facts to consider here. That's why the whole thing has to die.
Well, that's my question. Does this matter to anyone that doesn't actually care about the Catholic Church? What I mean by that, how much influence does the church still have around the world, and how much influence this right-wing section of the church? I mean, can they sway the outcome of elections in certain countries? Do they have enough leverage to be in on deciding who has power and who doesn't, and what kind of policies go forward?
Definitely, that's part of their agenda since the Vatican Council is to bring all the power back to Rome. So they actually appoint bishops, they appoint cardinals, and the cardinals appoint a pope. So yeah, there's a lot of power there, you see. And
there's still hundreds of millions of people in the church.
1.2 billion, they say. There are a lot of wonderful human beings who are Catholic. There are a lot of good priests still, and not enough, of course. They're literally dying off, and sisters too. But and especially I think in Asia and in Africa, there's a lot of vitality. But I learned from an organizer of organizations, a specialist of organizations. He said an organization of 1.2 billion people is just too much. No one can run it, he said. It's got to break into smaller groups. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. That's why the base communities, you see, beginning at the base, at the grassroots, that had so much promise. I just don't think you can run this hierarchical structure, this pyramid, much longer. And especially, as I say, nothing that humans are running today is going to last after 10 years unless, as a species, we make some real vital decisions and moves. And to his credit, Pope Francis is a leader in that, insofar as his encyclical Laudato Si leads on that. And he's been very strong in terms of climate change. Yes, he's made mistakes, but I think if he could turn the church around, in spite of all the right-wing oppression, he's getting that anyway. So why not do the real thing? Why not put the truth out there that Jesus didn't ordain any men or women? So you can't say that because you're a woman you can't be ordained. The priesthood was a 2nd century creation. So let's get the facts out there. And in the early church, in the 1st century, many women were leaders. That's very clear, including Mary Magdalene, a very close friend of Jesus. So there's a lot of new directions that the religious imagination could go in. And the right wing you're always going to have with you. You just have to move ahead without them.
All right, Matthew, in the next segment, we're going to go into Matthew's backstory. We're going to get into how Matthew became a priest and his battle with Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict, and more about the fight within the Catholic Church and why this all matters, because, more than 1 billion people in this church, and there's countries where the church can help decide who comes to power. And the United States is not without such influence itself. So please join us for the continuation of Reality Asserts Itself with Matthew Fox on the Real News Network.